in this video, we're going to put all of our learning about neurobiology together. So we understand how an action potential is generated, how an action potential is propagated, and how an action potential triggers the release of neurotransmitters. So let's now focus on how neurons actually communicate with each other and the pathway of information through our nervous system. So the first stop in our nervous system is our sensory neurons. They receive sensory input. They will then pass that sensory input to an interneuron. Those interneurons in our nervous system, central nervous system, our brain and our spinal cord, carry out integration. So they're going to determine the sensory input that's being received and decide which motor neurons should then do a response. So our third step then would be a motor neuron, which will then do the effect and cause muscles to contract and cause, say, movement or something like our diaphragm contracting, things like that. All right, so the simplest form of neuron communication is a reflex arc. A reflex is going to be a very fast nervous response, and you often don't need to necessarily think about your actions. It's just carried out as a way to keep you safe and maintain homeostasis. So we're going to use this example that you've probably had at the doctor's office when the doctor has taken like a little hammer and banged on your knee, and it's resulted in you kicking. And it happens in like a blink of an eye. But what's really occurring is your sensory neuron in your leg, specifically a stretch receptor, is going to then carry that information to an interneuron in your spinal cord. It will synapse with that interneuron. Neurotransmitters will trigger action potentials in the interneuron, which will then trigger the release of neurotransmitters to stimulate your motor neuron, and your motor neuron will carry the information to your muscle cells where neurotransmitters will be released, and it will cause the muscle cells to contract, so you kick. And so all this is occurring in the blink of an eye. So someone bumps into you, you kick them, keep yourself safe. Another example of a reflex arc could be burning your finger. Your finger is in the flame, and this could really hurt. And so you're damaging and killing your cells. So you need to quickly respond and remove your finger away. So what's going to happen is pain receptors in your skin, those are going to be connected to your sensory neurons. The sensory neurons will then generate action potentials and will synapse with an interneuron in your spinal cord. The interneuron will then synapse with a motor neuron, which will then synapse with your muscle cell. Your muscle will contract and you'll move your hand away from the fire so that you no longer burn and destroy your cells. So reflex arcs are very fast, quick, and they just involve 3 neurons at most. Sometimes they can even just involve 2 neurons, as we can see here in this pathway. It skips the interneuron. It goes straight from sensory neuron to motor neuron. And that's going to be a really fast response. Now, not all neural pathways are that simple. Some of them are going to involve multiple sensory neurons, multiple interneurons, multiple motor neurons. So let's just understand some examples of how exactly sensory input can be received. So your sensory neuron, which is going to be our first neuron in this picture, you're going to see this picture a lot because it shows nice communication between neurons. So this is our sensory neuron. It's going to hook up with an interneuron. So it's going to synapse with an interneuron. So the sensory neuron needs to communicate to the interneuron. So what's going to happen is the sensory neuron is going to receive some sort of sensory stimulus, and that sensory stimulus will cause sodium to enter the neuron. That sodium will trigger an action potential. Okay. Now those action potentials, those sodium ions, will then travel down the axon, generating action potentials at every node of Ranvier. Okay, so that saltatory conduction is going to result in fast communication down the axon. At the end of the axon, we have the synapse. The synapse is where the sensory neuron will come in close contact with the interneuron, and through the release of neurotransmitters, we'll be able to communicate a message to the interneuron. So let's look at some examples of how sensory neurons work in your body. We haven't gone into that in much detail. So let's look at your eyes first. Okay, in your eye, light is going to travel through your clear cornea. It's going to travel through your pupil, through your lens, and be focused on your retina, which is the back of your eye, which contains many neurons. So here we're zooming in on your retina in the back. Along the back of your retina, you have special nerve cells called cones and rods. Cones allow you to have color vision, and rods allow you to differentiate between light and dark. Okay, so these are modified neurons. There's a special chemical inside rods and cones. Rods have a special chemical called rhodopsin, which helps them in kind of be stimulated by light. They'll generate action potentials, and they're going to synapse. But in this case, they're not synapsing directly with an interneuron. There's going to be some intermediate sensory neurons. So in these cases, these blue cells here, those are bipolar and ganglion cells. So they're going to synapse with each other and kind of carry this communication of what the rods and cones receive until they eventually synapse with the optic nerve. Here you can see, here's our eyeball, here's the optic nerve. That optic nerve is going to carry that information to our brain, the interneurons in our visual cortex, which will then process it. So let's take a look a little bit closer about what's going on, and we're going to focus on rods. And what's going on in our rods to allow this action potential to be generated. All right, so this right here is our rod cell. Okay, inside our rod cell, we have this special compound called rhodopsin. Rhodopsin comes in two forms, the cis form and the trans form. When it is in the dark, the rhodopsin is in the cis form. And what's going to happen is sodium channels are going to open. And so here you can see sodium is going in through those ion channels into the rod cell. That's going to cause an action potential. Now, in this case, the action potential will eventually lead to a neurotransmitter being released. I know all these arrows are kind of confusing. You can kind of just ignore the decrease arrow right here. Okay, ignore that. What it just means is the neurotransmitter is going to be released, and that neurotransmitter happens to be an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which means that an inhibitory neurotransmitter is being released, and we are not causing an action potential. Instead, the bipolar cell, the next cell, is going to be hyperpolarized. And as a result, there's going to be no communication to our brain. It stops. And so that's why we see dark. Okay, when there's light, however, we have a different form of rhodopsin. It's the trans form. Okay, so again, ignore these arrows if it's kind of confusing to you. The sodium channels can't open, okay? So you're going to see that there's no sodium coming in. And as a result, we're not seeing depolarization of the membrane. We're actually seeing a hyperpolarization of the membrane. And what that means is there's going to be no neurotransmitter released. And that's a good thing because this is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So if there's no inhibitory response in the bipolar cell can then be depolarized by an excitatory response from another cell, and it can then convey information on. So basically we're shutting down the inhibition and we're allowing chemical signaling to go to our brain, and so this light information is reaching our brain and we're able to interpret that light and help form an image. So there you can see light is triggering sodium to enter the cell, and that is how we are generating this action potential. All right, so after sensory input is integration, and integration involves your interneurons of the central nervous system. So if this is our sensory neuron, and this is our interneuron. We need to stimulate this interneuron. So at the sensory neuron is going to release neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters are going to excite the interneuron. Okay? And an excitatory response means that sodium is going to flow in, and then we're going to see action potentials generated down the axon. All right, so propagating the action potentials down the axon, and then it will synapse with, here's my next cell. Not the best drawing, but that's my motor neuron. Okay, and these are my dendrites. Okay, so we're going to see a synapse there, and action potentials will be released, and it will communicate with the motor action potentials. Neurotransmitters will be released, and action potentials will be generated. So let's take a quick look at your central nervous system. So your central nervous system consists of your brain and spinal cord. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on your brain, but just understand that you have different regions of your brain that receive different sensory input, and then different regions of your brain that are going to be involved in motor output. So for example, we talked about vision. So the optic nerve is going to synapse back here at the back of your brain at your visual cortex. And the information that's received is then going to have to be integrated, and what you're seeing will then drive a motor response. So maybe you see something and you need to run away from what you see. So then it'll synapse with motor neurons, say, in your legs, so you can run away from the situation. So you're taking in visual information and interpreting it in this occipital lobe of your brain. There's also going to be other parts of your brain that deal with sound and speech, taste, okay? And then there are going to be parts that are more motor response. So your motor cortex is going to deal with your motor neurons and kind of communicating that out. So really you have integration, taking sensory information in, putting motor input out. We've looked at your spinal cord briefly before, but your spinal cord really is for quick responses. So you can see that it's much simpler. There's a sensory nerve pathway in and a motor nerve pathway out. And so it's really just in and out. There's not quite as much integration going on. It's going to be very fast. So after your interneuron has integrated its information, it then needs to pass it on to the motor neuron for a response. So here you can see our interneuron has had its action potential generated, okay, and then it's going to trigger the release of neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters are going to be released at the synapse between the interneuron and the motor neuron. They're going to generate an action potential in the motor neuron if it's an excitatory response, okay, and that will cause then sodium to rush in and generate action potentials all down the motor neuron until you eventually get to your muscle cells, which I'm going to represent by these striped lines here, because you have striated muscle, which is involved in contractions for motor movement. All right, so this is our last slide. There's going to be a video just on motor neurons and the neuromuscular junction and how muscles actually contract. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but just to understand and reinforce this idea, the dendrites are what's going to receive the information. So that's where that's where you're going to have your little receptors for your neurotransmitters. They're going to be on the dendrites and along the cell body. And your neurotransmitters are going to be released from your from your interneuron. And they will bind to those receptors. And if the receptors are excitatory, we're going to see that sodium is going to rush into the cell. So it'd be rushing in through those receptors. It's just, I don't have a lot of room to draw it. So sodium ion is going to rush in, and we might have enough to generate our action potential. So an action potential is generated. Sodium ion is going to flow down underneath those myelin sheaths. It's going to generate again at the next node, and again at the next node, and we'll keep having sodium flowing down until it finally reaches the synapse, that action potential is going to cause calcium to flow into the motor neuron, which will trigger the release of neurotransmitters, which will bind to muscle fibers, and muscles actually will generate action potentials as well. And the action potentials is what's going to trigger the contraction of the motor neuron. So we have just walked through sensory integration and then motor response. And it took me 15 minutes to go through all this. So just imagine, this takes fractions of a second. Okay, in the amount of time I've talked to you, millions and millions of times, these action potentials have been generated and neurons have been firing in your body, and you didn't even think about it. Isn't your body truly amazing that you're able to do all of this so quickly without any thought? So your nervous system is really remarkable. So hopefully this helps you understand and put the ideas together of how sensory neurons integrate synapse with interneurons, which synapse with motor neurons to get our response.